Ghost's Daughter. Part 1, The Woman No One Saw. The room had no windows. That was the first thing you notice about Conference Room B7 in the basement of the Pentagon. No windows, no natural light, just fluorescent tubes humming overhead and a long oak table that had absorbed 30 years of classified conversations without giving any of them back. It was March of 2012. 7 men and 1 woman sat around that table. Generals, intelligence directors, a deputy secretary of defense whose name would not appear in any public record of this meeting. They had been summoned here to review a file that had spent 3 years locked in a vault at Langley, a file that 3 different administrations had agreed quietly and without fanfare should never see the light of a courtroom or a congressional hearing. The chairman of the review board opened the folder. He read for a moment without speaking. His face gave away nothing. Men who sit at tables like this learn early how to keep their faces still. But his right hand, the one not holding the folder, pressed flat against the oak surface. Pressed hard. Like he needed the table to be real beneath him. Then he read aloud. Shooter. Corpsman Maya Callahan. 1st Marine Recon, FOB Wolverine, Kunar Province, Afghanistan. Confirmed engagement distance, 1,240 meters. Engagement conditions. Gunshot wound to left shoulder, left arm, non-functional prone position, unsupported. Low light 0340 hours local. He stopped. He set the folder down very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are not entirely steady. Then he said, what I am about to tell you has been sealed for 3 years. There were reasons for that. Some of those reasons were legitimate. Most of them were not. He looked at the faces around the table. He said it begins in September of 2009, and it begins with a young woman that nobody saw coming. Kunar Province, Afghanistan, September 14th, 2009. The helicopter came in low and fast the way they always came in over Kunar, because Kunar was the kind of province that punished anything slow. The Pitch River Valley cut through the mountains below like a scar that had never healed properly, and the ridgelines on either side had been watching American convoys since 2002 with the patient, indifferent attention of geography that has outlasted every army that ever crossed it. FOB Wolverine sat at an elevation of 4,200 feet. At that altitude, the air had a quality to it that you either respected or ignored, and the ones who ignored it usually ended up in the aid station inside of a week. The base was small by the standards of the war. 312 personnel at full strength, plywood structures reinforced with sandbags, HESCO barriers on the perimeter, a landing zone that was barely large enough for a Black Hawk to set down clean. The kind of place where the generators ran 22 hours a day, and the last 2 hours felt like the loudest silence you had ever heard. Maya Callahan stepped off the CH-47 at 0845 hours. She was carrying a medical pack, a rifle, and a personal bag. Total weight approximately 71 pounds. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 118 pounds, which meant the load she was carrying represented more than 60% of her own body weight. She walked off the ramp without adjusting her stride, without pausing, without looking at the ground to check her footing. She just walked. The crew chief who helped her off the ramp watched her go and then looked at the next personnel stepping down, a logistics specialist twice her size who grabbed the ramp rail for support on the incline. The crew chief did not say anything. He just watched her until she was across the landing zone and then went back to unloading cargo. Master Sergeant Cole Reeves saw her from 50 yards away. He was standing outside the operations building with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, reviewing a vehicle maintenance report that was not going to give him good news no matter how many times he read it. He was 48 years old and he had spent 26 of those years in the Marine Corps, and in those 26 years he had developed the particular kind of vision that comes not from training but from accumulation. From watching enough people come off enough helicopters in enough bad places that your eyes start to notice things before your brain explains why. He noticed her hands first. Most people, when they step off a helicopter onto an unfamiliar base, use their hands instinctively. They adjust straps, they reach out for balance, they check their gear. It is not a conscious gesture. It is the body doing what the body does when it lands somewhere it has never been. Her hands were still, not the stillness of someone who was trying to look calm, the stillness of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to adjust. The stillness of someone who had been in worse places than this and had arrived safely from all of them. Reeves drank his cold coffee and watched her cross the landing zone and said nothing to nobody. Staff Sergeant Mac Brody had a different reaction. He saw her at the afternoon formation and made no effort to conceal his assessment. He was 35, built like something that had been compressed under high pressure for a long time, with a jaw like a shelf bracket and a voice that had never learned the difference between speaking and informing. He had been with 1st Recon for 4 years. He had watched 11 replacement personnel come through FOB Wolverine, and of those 11, 3 had transferred out inside of 60 days, and 2 had been medevaced inside of 90. He looked at Maya Callahan standing at the back of the formation with her medical pack and her regulation haircut and her expression that showed absolutely nothing, and he ran his standard calculation. Too small, too quiet, 2 weeks, maybe 3. He gave her the kind of look that is not technically a challenge but functions as one. The look that says the bar is where it is and the bar does not move for anybody, and then he turned back to the formation board. Colonel Derek Harmon ran the briefing. He was 52 years old and had the kind of face that had been weathered into something almost geological. All sharp angles and flat planes, the product of 3 decades of sun and cold, and the specific strain that comes from being responsible for other people's lives in places where mistakes are permanent. He read through the new personnel assignments without ceremony. FOB Wolverine was not a base that did ceremony well. There was not enough time and not enough space, and the mountains did not care. When he reached her name, he paused. It was brief, a fraction of a second, the kind of pause that only Reeves, who was watching Harmon rather than his own copy of the assignment sheet, would have caught. Callahan, Combat Corpsman, Forward Medical Support, assigned to Charlie Element. Harmon moved on. His voice did not change. His face did not change, but his right hand holding the assignment sheet pressed slightly harder against the paper. Reeves noticed. He filed it away beside what he had noticed about her hands. That evening in the plywood-walled office that served as FOB Wolverine's personnel section, Reeves pulled Maya Callahan's service jacket. What he found was a document that was mostly architecture. There were dates, there were official stamps, there was the standard paperwork that followed any service member through the system, the kind of bureaucratic sediment that accumulates regardless of what the person is actually doing. And then, covering a period of roughly 3 years before her Navy enlistment, there was nothing, not a gap, not a missing section. 3 years that had not been left blank but had been specifically, deliberately, professionally removed. Reeves had seen redacted files before. Classified, operations, special assignments, the paper residue of things that officially never happened. He knew what it looked like when information was withheld because it was sensitive. This was different. This looked like something had been erased. He sat with that for a long moment, and in the way that men who have learned to trust their instincts sit with things, not rushing to conclusions, but not walking away either. Then he pulled a second file, an older one from a different cabinet. Jack Callahan's archived personnel jacket routed to FOB Wolverine's records section in 2004 as part of the standard effects processing that followed a KYA. Most of the file was administrative residue, the paperwork sediment of a career. He spent 4 minutes with it, cross-referencing dates and postings and the particular geography of a service record that ran parallel to the one in front of him in ways that were not coincidental. Then he found it. Clipped to the inside back cover of Jack Callahan's file in a small evidence envelope, marked personal effects insufficient for separate shipping, there was a single item, 1 round, .308 caliber primer removed. On the brass casing etched was something sharp and patient, 2 words, Little Ghost. Reeves held it in his palm for a long moment. He understood then why the name on the new corpsman's file had stopped him cold. And he understood something else, which was that the 3 missing years and the hands that moved wrong for a medic and the calluses in the wrong places were not separate facts. They were the same facts seen from different angles. He closed both files. He put them back. He walked to the berthing area and placed the brass round on Maya Callahan's rack. Not on the pillow, not in an obvious place. On the edge of the rack frame, where you would see it when you came back at the end of the day and dropped your gear and finally had a moment of stillness. He walked away without waiting. Maya's rack was in a corner of the female-designated berthing, which at FOB Wolverine meant a plywood partition in one end of a larger structure, separated by a curtain that served as much as a courtesy as a door. She had the space to herself. The previous female personnel assigned to Wolverine had rotated out 6 weeks earlier. She unpacked with the efficiency of someone who had done this in a very large number of temporary places. Medical pack by the left side of the rack, organized by access priority. Rifle on the wall mount cleaned and ready. Personal bag under the rack. She moved through it quickly and without wasted motion. The way you move when unpacking is not a settling in, but a reset when you have learned not to think of any place as permanent, because permanence is not a thing that your life permits. At the bottom of the personal bag, beneath spare socks, in a worn paperback medical reference, and a small photograph in a plastic sleeve, there was an envelope. Standard military issue. White, slightly creased from years of being handled and refolded and carried and not opened. The name on the front was written in a hand that was not hers. The handwriting was precise and economical, the handwriting of a man who had learned that every word costs something, and so you do not spend words you do not need. It said only Maya. She picked it up, held it for a moment with the particular kind of stillness that is the opposite of indifference. Then she placed it back at the bottom of the bag and covered it with the spare socks and zipped the bag shut and put it under the rack. 5 years. The letter had been in her possession for 5 years. She had carried it through Syria and back. She had carried it through the 6 weeks of deep cover that had kept her from her father's funeral, through the long flight home that arrived 42 days after he was in the ground, through the conversation at the graveside with a mother who had aged a decade in less than 2 months. She had carried it through her Navy enlistment in 2 previous postings, and now she had carried it here to Kunar province, 4,200 feet above a river that did not care about any of them. She had not opened it. She could not have explained why not in any way that would make sense to someone who had not been where she had been or lost what she had lost. The letter was her father's last night alive, put down in ink. Opening it would make that night real in a way that 5 years of carrying it had somehow not accomplished. Opening it would mean being in that room with him in whatever plywood structure or tent or concrete building he had found to write in on the night before a mission he had known was wrong. She was not ready for that. She turned off the light and lay on the rack in the dark and listened to the FOB settle into its nighttime rhythm generators and distant radio traffic and the wind coming off the mountains with the cold authority of elevation. She counted her heartbeats. 60 per minute, resting rate. It had been 60 per minute since she was 19 years old, and her father had taught her what to do with adrenaline instead of letting it do things to her. You do not fight it. You do not pretend it is not there. You give it a path. 4 counts in, hold 7, 80 counts out. You give the body a moment, and the body does the job, and the adrenaline becomes fuel instead of noise. She fell asleep at 60 beats per minute. The ruck march was Brody's idea. Not officially. The training schedule listed it as a mandatory conditioning event, 12 miles in full kit in the Kunar heat, which at 0700 on a September morning was already pushing 86 degrees and would be above 100 by mile 6. It was a legitimate training requirement. Everything about it was legitimate. But the pace Brody set was not the pace you set for a conditioning event. The pace Brody set was the pace you set when you want to find out what somebody is made of before the job finds out for you. It was just below the threshold of punishment, just inside the boundary of what you could defend if someone asked why you pushed it that hard. It was the pace that separated the ones who belonged from the ones who thought they did. The formation moved out at 0712. By mile 2, the spacing had started to change. The stronger personnel pulling ahead the others, finding their limit and settling into it, the natural sorting that physical effort imposes regardless of rank or expectation. Brody was at the front, setting the metronome, watching the gap behind him, the way a shepherd watches a flock he suspects of having a weak member. He did not look back for the first 4 miles. At mile 5, he looked. She was 6 feet behind him, not breathing hard, not adjusting her pack, not doing any of the small compensating movements that the body makes when it is working close to its limit. She was just moving one foot in front of the other with the mechanical steadiness of something that had been calibrated for exactly this. Her eyes forward, her face showing nothing but the simple focused attention of someone doing a thing they have done many times before. Brody looked away. He increased the pace by half a step. She stayed 6 feet back. By mile 9, 4 personnel had dropped out with heat and fatigue. By mile 11, 2 more. When the formation crossed the finish marker, at mile 12, there were 14 of the original 20 still moving. Maya Callahan was among them. She had been 6 feet behind Brody for the last 7 miles. When they stopped, she stopped. She unclipped her chin strap, adjusted her pack weight to her hips, and began her cool down the way you cool down after a long effort, methodically without drama, breathing out through pursed lips. Brody watched her for a moment. He did not speak. He turned and walked away, and in the angle of his shoulders there was something that had not been there before. Not respect, not yet, but the beginning of a question where before there had only been an answer. Reeves, who had run the route as well and finished near the front, watched Brody walk away, and then looked at Maya and said nothing. He had served with enough people in enough hard places to know the difference between someone who was tough and someone who was trained. Toughness was what the body did when it had no choice. Training was what the body did because it had been taught to do it before the choice became necessary. What he had just watched was not toughness. 3 days later, it was the hands that confirmed it. The platoon was running combat movement drills on the flat ground south of the wire. Noon. The temperature had climbed to 109 degrees in the shade, and there was not much shade. Private First Class Everett Cole was 22 years old, fresh enough that the fob had not yet worn the optimism off his face, the kind of young that has not yet learned that immortality is a feeling and not a fact. Cole had been pushing hard all morning, the kind of hard that young men push when they are trying to prove something to themselves and have not yet understood that there is nothing to prove and no one keeping score. By the time the formation was 4 hours in, he had stopped sweating. That was the sign. Not the flushed face, or the elevated breathing, or the slight stumble at the edge of a step. All of those were heat stress, manageable, the body sending early warning signals that a trained eye could catch and correct. But when a person stops sweating in 109-degree heat, the body has moved past its ability to manage and into a different territory. Maya was with the Charlie element 30 meters away when she saw it. She was on her feet before the thought was fully formed. Brody turned. "Doc, we're in the middle of..." She said, "Pull Cole out of the drill right now." She said it the way you say things when the timing is not a matter of preference. Core temperature is above 104. He stopped sweating 8 minutes ago. Another 5 minutes, and he seizes. Brody's jaw tightened. He had been contradicted in front of his people, and he was not a man who absorbed contradiction easily. But he had also been in the field long enough to know that combat medics did not make calls like this for reasons other than the call being necessary. He pulled Cole. Maya reached him as his knees began to buckle. She caught the weight with the practiced efficiency of someone who had caught this particular kind of weight before lowered him to the ground with a control that his size should not have permitted from someone her size. Skin hot and dry to the touch. Pupils unequal. Heart rate 108 and climbing. She was already into her medical pack. 4-line, 18-gauge antecubital fossa. First try even in the heat when veins pull back from the surface and the body hoards whatever fluid it has left. Normal saline wide open. Ice packs from the pack's insulated section axilla and groin. She called out the instructions to the 2 Marines who had come forward to help clear and specific the tone of someone who was not asking them to do something but informing them of what was about to happen. Cole's eyes rolled back. He began to seize. On his side, immediately airway protected the intervention performed with the smooth economy of something so thoroughly drilled that it had ceased to require conscious thought. The Marines around her had gone still, watching with the particular attention of men who have just understood that the situation is more serious than it looked 30 seconds ago. 6 minutes and 40 seconds from the first intervention. Cole's vitals began to stabilize. Reeves, who had been standing back with his arms crossed since the moment Maya moved, watched her work with the expression of a man who was finishing the process of adding numbers he started adding days ago. He had watched the hands during the ruck march, how they never reached for the pack straps when fatigue set in, how they stayed at her sides the way trained hands stay ready rather than resting. He had watched them during the medical training session that she had run the day prior. The needle decompression demonstration she had performed on herself, the anatomical precision that had made the Marine with the most combat medical experience in the room lean slightly forward without realizing it. And now he was watching her insert an IV line on a seizing patient in 109-degree heat on her first attempt. Reeves had been in the Marine Corps for 26 years. He had worked with skilled medics. He had worked with outstanding medics. He had worked twice with people who moved through emergency medicine the way certain people move through violence, with an ease that was not indifference but the opposite of it, a total command of the space between themselves and the emergency that made everything they did look unhurried even when it was happening very fast. He was watching that now. He thought again about the 2 files, about the 3 missing years in the archived personnel jacket and the small brass round in the evidence envelope, about the distance between who she appeared to be and what her hands already knew. She found the round that evening when she came back from the aid station where Cole was stable and embarrassed and grateful in roughly equal measure. She had told him to drink more water, which was not the most profound medical advice she had ever given, but was the most applicable. She came through the curtain into the berthing and saw it on the rack frame and picked it up. She turned it in her fingers. She read the 2 words etched into the brass. She held it for a long time, standing in the small space with the curtain at her back and the dying light coming through the gap in the plywood wall, and her face showed something that it had not shown since she arrived at FOB Wolverine. Not grief, not surprise. Something quieter than either of those. The look of someone who has been recognized by a stranger and is still deciding what that means. Then she reached under the rack and pulled out the personal bag. She unzipped it. She moved the spare socks. She took out the white envelope and held it alongside the small brass round. The handwriting on the envelope, the etching on the brass, The same man's precision in both the same economy of language that said only what needed to be said and trusted the reader to carry the rest. Jack, Ghost, Callahan. She sat down on the rack's edge. She held both things in her hands, the letter and the round one in each palm, and she sat there in the fading Kunar light for a very long time. The generators hummed. The mountains did what mountains do, which is stand there and wait. She did not open the envelope. She placed the brass round inside the unsealed flap, pressed the envelope flat, and put it back at the bottom of the bag. Then she checked her weapon, inventoried her medical pack, ate a cold MRE without tasting it, and lay down on the rack in the dark. 60 beats per minute. She counted them. She was still counting when the mission brief came down at 2100 hours, and Harmon's voice came over the base PA and told the assembled personnel of FOB Wolverine that Alpha Team would roll at 2200. And she was still counting 2 hours later when the first helicopter lifted off into the Kunar night and she was left on the ground with her medical pack and her rifle and the white envelope in the bottom of her bag, still in Charlie Element, still in the back. Still, as far as anyone here was officially concerned, the small, quiet corpsman that nobody had seen coming and nobody quite yet had seen at all. But Reeves had seen the hands, and Brody had watched Mile 12. And in a plywood office on the far side of the base, Colonel Derek Harmon was sitting at his desk, looking at nothing in particular, and his right hand was pressed flat on the surface, and the name he was not saying out loud was the same name he had spent 25 years trying to put to rest in the part of him that had never entirely forgiven or entirely forgotten. Callahan. The mountain wind came down off the ridgeline and moved through the base with the indifferent authority of altitude and cold, and the generators kept running, and somewhere in the dark 40 kilometers to the north, 2 American contractors were still alive and waiting to find out if anyone was coming for them. The night was not finished with any of them yet. Part 2, The Weight of a Promise. The call came at 1:17 hours. Not the call anyone wanted, the kind that arrives in the dark with no preamble and no grace. A single transmission on the Alpha Team frequency that cut through the static like something being torn open. Contact, IED, 2 men down. And then the call sign for the Alpha Team senior non-medic who had a tourniquet and 2 hands in training that stopped well short of what was lying on the ground in front of him. We need Doc, now. Brody was already on the radio before the transmission finished. He was running the call sign protocol. The established response, the correct response, the response that existed because responses to things like this needed to exist before the things happened, so that when they happened, nobody had to think. He said, Charlie Element, hold position. Stand by for... Maya was already running. She did not make a decision. That was the part that people who were not trained the way she was trained never quite understood about moments like this. There was no decision. There was what the body had been built to do, and then there was the body doing it, and the space between those two things was so small, it was not measurable by anything she had available. 70 pounds of gear, and she ran like she was carrying nothing. The distance was 300 meters of Afghan night, which meant uneven ground you could not see clearly, and the possibility of secondary devices and incoming fire that had not stopped just because 2 Marines were on the ground and she was moving toward them. She ran through all of it with the medical pack against her back and the rifle across her chest and the Kunar darkness pressing in from every side. Brody's voice behind her. Dr. Callahan, Commander said. She did not stop. Could not stop. The mathematics were simple, and they were the only mathematics that mattered right now. Tension pneumothorax would kill in 3 minutes without intervention. Femoral hemorrhage would kill in 90 seconds. Every second she spent not running was a second subtracted from what remained. She reached Alpha's position behind a low stone wall with the firefight still active muzzle flashes sparking in the darkness 200 meters out the sharp crack of incoming rounds against rock. She dropped beside the first casualty without breaking stride and went to work. The chest wound was what she had known it would be from the transmission. Blood with air in it, the bubbling signature of a penetrating lung injury, the chest wall moving wrong on the left side. She had the needle decompression kit in her hand before her knees hit the ground. 14-gauge catheter, second intercostal space mid-clavicular line. She found the landmark in the dark by touch because she had found it 100 times in the dark and in worse places than this, and she pushed the needle in at 90 degrees and felt the rush of air that meant she had done it correctly. The Marine's breathing changed immediately. She did not wait to watch. She was already moving. The second man was worse. The tourniquet had been applied by someone with training, but not enough of it, too low and not tight enough, and arterial blood was still moving through, dark and pressurized and fast. She ripped the old tourniquet off and applied a replacement high and tight, In 4 seconds, felt the pulsive flow diminish and stop, and then opened the wound packing with her teeth because both hands were occupied. Hemostatic gauze. She pushed it in deep and held pressure with both hands and counted. She counted the way her father had taught her to count things that mattered. Not in seconds, but in heartbeats, because heartbeats were honest in a way that seconds were not. 1, 2, 3. The firefight moved around her like weather. She heard Harmon's voice on the radio giving suppression coordinates. She heard Brody calling the assault element. She heard the deeper, slower report of American weapons establishing fire superiority. She did not lift her head. She did not look toward the sound. She held pressure and she counted. And the world outside the circle of her hands was someone else's problem for the next 3 minutes. Reeves, who had moved to her left and was managing the first casualty's chest seal, watched her work from 18 inches away. He had been in combat medicine scenarios with trained corps men for a quarter century. He knew what competence looked like at the edge of disaster. This was not competence. This was something that competence was several years of hard experience away from becoming. He said nothing. He held the chest seal and watched and kept his own count. 170 seconds. The bleeding stopped. She called it on the radio with the same tone she used to report supply inventory. 2 casualties stabilized. 1 tension pneumothorax decompressed, 1 femoral hemorrhage controlled. Request medevac soonest. Both should hold. Harmon's voice came back tight but steady. Copy, Doc. Medevac is 18 minutes out. Then the shot. Not incoming. Not random. A single deliberate report from a position she had not registered because she had been doing medicine and not surveillance, which was exactly what she had been assigned to do and exactly what had nearly gotten the commanding officer killed in the time it took her to complete that assignment. The round hit the wall 2 feet from Harmon's head. Stone fragments scattered. He dropped flat by reflex, which was the reflex that kept him alive, and when he came up from the ground, his hand was going to his sidearm instead of his radio, which was the wrong tool for the problem. She saw the position before she understood she was seeing it. 400 meters out, a rooftop edge. The angular silhouette of a man with a long rifle who had just adjusted his aim to account for Harmon dropping, which meant he was not done. She did not think about the Barrett M82 lying beside the first casualty. She did not decide to pick it up. She picked it up the way you pick up the right tool when the mount is in front of you, because her hands had been built for exactly this kind of geometry, and they went to it without being asked. 50 caliber, bipod deployed, prone position, eye to scope. The target was stationary. 400 meters in NVG green. She had made this shot at 250 meters further in conditions worse than this when she was 19 years old on a Montana hillside with her father watching and her breath making small clouds in the cold air. She squeezed. The round went high and right by 14 inches. Close enough to make the man flinch and reacquire. Not close enough. She cycled the bolt. The target was moving now, rifle swinging toward her muzzle flash, and she had approximately 2 seconds before he had the angle. She adjusted 4 clicks, left breathed out to the empty space between heartbeats and squeezed again. Center mass. The man came off the roof. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. In combat, that is a long time. Long enough for every Marine in the position to process what they had just witnessed, which was a corpsman in a prone position using a weapon that was not hers to make a 400-meter shot in the dark on a target that had just nearly killed their commanding officer. Brody spoke first. He said nothing intelligible. It was a sound rather than words, the verbal equivalent of a man's internal framework encountering something it was not structured to accommodate. She set the Barrett down beside the casualty whose rifle it was. She stood. She picked up her medical pack. She said, "Casualties are stable, sir. Recommend immediate exfil to landing zone for medevac transfer." Harmon had not moved from where he was standing. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who has just heard a voice from 25 years ago come out of a face he has never seen before. His mouth was open slightly. His hands were at his sides. He looked down at his copy of the personnel manifest. He looked back at her. He said her name the way you say a word that you have been trying not to think for a long time, and it comes out of you anyway. Callahan. She met his eyes. She waited. He said nothing else. Not then. He turned to Brody and began the exfil sequence, and the machinery of the unit reassembled itself around the 2 wounded men and the medevac timeline, and Maya went back to doing what she had come out here to do, which was keep those 2 men alive until a helicopter arrived to take that responsibility from her. But Reeves had watched Harmon say her name, and he understood now what he had been adding up. The debrief happened 40 minutes after the casualties were loaded and the medevac lifted off in the narrow plywood room that served as FOB Wolverine's operations center. The fluorescent light overhead had a flicker in it that nobody had fixed because there were approximately 600 things more urgent than a flickering light, and the flicker gave the room an unsteady quality that suited the conversation Harmon had called them there to have. Brody was there. Reeves was there. Maya was there. Harmon stood at the head of the table and looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. He said your last 3 years before Navy service are classified at a level I do not have clearance to access. He said you just made a 400-meter shot at night with a weapon that is not yours from a cold bore under fire after performing emergency trauma medicine for 9 minutes. He said your name is Callahan. Maya said yes, sir. He said Jack Callahan was your father. She said yes, sir. Harmon put both hands flat on the table. He looked at them for a moment. He was quiet in the way that men are quiet when they are deciding how much of a thing to say out loud and how much to keep carrying privately. Then he looked up. He said, I knew your father. I want to tell you 2 things about that. The first one reflects badly on me, and I will tell it accurately. He said I was 27 years old in 1984. I had been through officer candidate school, and I was certain in the way that 27-year-olds who have survived OCS are certain that I was ready for anything the Navy could present me with. I signed up for BUD/S because I believed that, because I thought certainty was the same thing as preparation. The fluorescent light flickered once overhead. Your father was one of the instructors during Hell Week, Harmon continued. Second day, I was hypothermic and running on almost no sleep, and I believed I was still the person I had been before the water and the cold and the sand got involved. He pulled me aside and looked at me the way I learned later he looked at everyone he was going to pull, like he was reading something written on the inside of your chest. And he said, Harmon, you are a brave man, but you are not a killer, not naturally. Not in the way this work requires. You would hesitate at the moment that cannot afford hesitation, and that hesitation would cost lives. Yours or someone else's. I am pulling you now because it is better to hear this from me than to learn it in the field. Harmon's jaw tightened. I hated him for 15 years, he said. I told myself he was wrong. I built a career on proving him wrong or trying to. Made colonel, commanded units, put myself in places where I would have to make the decision he said I couldn't make. He looked at Maya directly. He was right about all of it. I know that now. I have known it for a long time. The hesitation he described, I have felt it in situations that could not afford it. I live with the consequences. He paused. He said, that is the first thing. The room held the weight of what was coming. In 2004, Harmon said I was assigned to a joint intelligence coordination role at Bagram. I was processing and approving operational intelligence assessments for missions in Kunar and Nuristan province. In March of 2004, I approved an assessment targeting a compound near the Peach River. The intelligence indicated a Taliban logistics node. I approved a direct action mission. He looked at the tent wall for a moment. The fluorescent light above the table was flickering again, and the unsteadiness of it seemed appropriate for what he was saying. The intelligence was wrong, he said. It had been compromised at the source. The compound was not what the assessment said it was. What it was a location that an active SEAL element was using for an intelligence collection operation. SEAL Team 3, a 4-man unit that had been operating in that area for 11 days. I did not know they were there. Nobody told me because the coordination between the Direct Action Planning Cell and the Special Operations Intelligence Cell had failed in the way large organizations sometimes fail quietly and with consequences entirely out of proportion to the bureaucratic failure that caused them. His voice did not change. He had practiced delivering this information without it changing because some information has to be delivered regardless of what it costs you to say it. 3 men died in the initial strike, he said. The 4th survived long enough to establish communications and request extraction. He maintained those communications for 43 minutes. The transcript is classified. I have read it many times. He looked at Maya. The 4th man's name was Jack Callahan. The room was quiet enough that the generator outside the wall was the loudest thing in it. Reeves had not moved. Brody was looking at the table. He bled out before the extraction element reached him. Harmon said, I signed the order that put his team in that position. There was an investigation. The findings were classified and managed in the administrative way these things are managed. I received a formal reprimand that was removed from my record 2 years later. I have thought about your father every day since March of 2004. And now you are standing in my unit, having just saved my life, and I do not have words adequate to what that means. Maya had not moved during any of this. When Harmon finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said my father knew the intelligence was compromised before the mission launched. He flagged it through his chain of command and was told the assessment had been verified above his level. He went anyway because his team was going and he would not let them go without him. He maintained communications for 43 minutes because that was his job, and he did his job until he could not anymore. She said he did not die because of you, Kearney. He died because of the particular way large organizations fail when people inside them confuse process for judgment. You were inside that system. You were not the system itself. Harmon said nothing for a long moment. Then he nodded once slowly with the careful precision of a man accepting something he is not certain he has earned. Then he opened the intelligence folder that had been sitting closed on the table. He said, we still have 2 contractors alive in that compound, and we have a problem. The folder contained photographs. Reeves spread them across the table. 8 images, 7 crime scenes and 1 surveillance capture, long distance but clear enough to read. Alexei Drachev, 44 years old. Spetsnaz service 1998 to 2015. Chechnya, Georgia, 2 rotations to Syria. Confirmed kills in official records 23. Estimated actual north of 50. The photographs of his work were clinical in the way that work performed without emotional investment is clinical. Single entry wounds, long range, no evidence of secondary rounds, every engagement resolved with 1 shot. Orseus T5000, .338 Lapua Magnum. Effective range in his hands 1,500 meters, possibly further. Maya studied each photograph in the order Reeves had laid them out. She was not looking at them the way you look at evidence. She was looking at them the way you look at a map of someone's thinking. The shot angles, the position of the bodies relative to natural cover, the distance between the entry points and the nearest terrain feature that offered concealment. She said he sets up early, 8 to 10 hours before engagement in most of these. Reeves said the British patrol, 3 weeks ago. Thermal imaging put him in position at least 8 hours prior to the shot. She said he takes high ground, but not maximum elevation. He wants cover and 3 exit routes. He does not take positions that are obvious to a trained counter-sniper because he assumes he will eventually face one. He is patient and he does not take unnecessary risks. She pointed to the satellite image of the compound and surrounding terrain. She said ridgeline northeast, 800 meters from the compound. Clear sight lines to every approach vector. 3 natural egress routes. It is where he will be. Harmon said that is the same assessment our intelligence element reached. She said then we agree on his position. The question is where I go. She moved her finger south and west across the map to a depression in the terrain, a shallow wadi running perpendicular to the primary ridgeline. She said here. Brody looked at it and shook his head slightly. Low ground, no natural elevation advantage, exposed approach from the east. She said it is not a natural sniper position. It is too low. The angle to the compound is suboptimal from a conventional standpoint, and the approach leaves you visible for 200 meters. No one with Drachev's training would look for a counter-sniper here because no counter-sniper would choose it. She said, which is why it is perfect. She said the distance from that wadi to his probable position on the northeast ridgeline is approximately 1,240 meters. Brody looked at her and then looked at the map and then looked at her again. She said, I can make that shot. She said it the way her father had said things that were true without inflation and without apology. Harmon said the assault team goes in tomorrow night. You would insert 6 hours prior, alone. She said, yes, sir. Reeves had not spoken for 20 minutes. Now he said quietly to no one in particular that he needed to check something in the equipment storage. He left the room without waiting for a response. He came back 40 minutes later after the planning session had concluded and the assignments had been confirmed and the platoon had dispersed to prepare. He came back carrying a rifle case. Standard military hard case, olive drab latches worn from handling. There was stenciling on the side that had faded over 5 years of storage to the point where it was almost illegible. Almost. MSG, Jack Callahan, SEAL Team 3. He had found it in the back of the equipment storage building behind a row of deprecated radio cases in a corner that the inventory system had apparently not revisited since 2004. It had been shipped from Kunar with Jack Callahan's personal effects and routed to long-term storage because that was what happened to things that arrived at a logistics node without clear forwarding instructions and without anyone left in the original unit to claim them. 5 years in a storage building 40 kilometers from where the man who owned it had died. Reeves set the case on the rack beside Maya's gear. He opened the latches. The M24 inside had a custom stock walnut fitted to a specific set of dimensions that were not standard issue. The barrel was match grade. The scope mounts were precision fitted. It was a rifle that had been built for one person and calibrated over years of use to that person's particular geometry, their eye relief and their cheek weld, and the specific pressure of their right hand against the grip. On the wooden forend, carved in letters small enough that you had to look for them, were 2 words. Little ghost. Reeves straightened up. He stepped back from the rack. He did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the rifle did not already say more precisely. He turned and walked to the curtain and stopped with his back to her. He said he would want you to have it. Then he left. She stood in the small space for a long time. She picked up the rifle. She held it with both hands and felt the weight of it, which was the weight of 17 years of Saturday mornings on a Montana slope, and the particular patience her father had built into her before she had words for what he was building, and the weight of the man himself present in every calibrated surface and fitted joint of the thing he had carried and trusted and used, and finally left behind in a country that did not deserve the keeping of it. She had made a promise. She had made it at his grave with her mother's hands in hers and the Montana sky above them, both gray and cold, in the way that late spring skies in the high country could be cold. A sky that did not offer comfort or condemnation, just its own vast indifference. She had meant the promise with everything she had. She had built her service around it, had shaped her identity around it, had spent 5 years learning to be the version of herself that did not require the thing she was now holding. She sat on the rack with the rifle across her knees. She did not open the envelope. She did not need to. She already knew what she was going to do. She had known it since the moment she had reached into the dark for the Barrett and found it exactly where her hands expected it to be. At 2100 hours, she checked out through the gate alone. The temperature had already begun its descent. In Kunar province at this elevation, September nights did not negotiate. The cold came down off the ridgelines with the matter-of-fact authority of altitude, and by midnight the temperature would be in the upper 40s, and by 0300 it would be at the freezing boundary, and the ground would be hard under her knees. She covered the 3 kilometers to the wadi in 2 hours. Not because 3 kilometers in 2 hours is difficult, because 3 kilometers into a counter-sniper position when the man you are countering has 50-plus kills and 8 hours of patience as his standard operating procedure requires that you move the way the terrain itself moves, without straight lines or predictable patterns, without anything that a trained eye at distance would register as human. She had learned this in Syria. She found the position she had marked on the map and spent 22 minutes building a hide that would not have been recognizable as a hide to anyone who did not already know it was there. Thermal blanket under the prone surface. Natural materials arranged to break the human outline. A firing position that gave her the angle she needed while presenting the smallest possible visible signature. She settled in. Through the scope, she ranged the northeast ridgeline and confirmed the distance. 1,238 meters to the nearest likely position. 1,251 to the furthest. The wind at her current position was from the northwest at approximately 7 miles per hour. She clicked the appropriate windage compensation. She adjusted elevation for the bullet drop. At this range, the massive parabolic arc that a 308 round traveled over 12 plus 100 meters, nearly 90 inches of drop that you either calculated correctly or did not get a second chance to correct. Then she waited. She counted heartbeats. The stars wheeled overhead in the way they had been wheeling over this particular piece of ground for a duration so vast that the entire history of human violence on it was not even a rounding error. Orion to the west, Cassiopeia almost directly overhead. The same constellations her father had used to navigate on night moves when she was 12 years old, and he was teaching her that the sky was a tool like any other tool, that it rewarded the people who learned to read it and ignored everyone else. She thought about her father, about his voice in the Montana cold, and the particular quality of patience he had tried to build into her from the beginning. She thought about what it meant to carry something for 17 years and then be asked in the dark of a wadi in Kunar province whether you were willing to use it. She did not think about the promise. She thought about the 2 men in the compound 40 kilometers north. She thought about the assault team that would breach that gate at 0346 hours and step into Drachev's field of fire if she was not where she needed to be when she needed to be there. She thought about the letter in the bottom of the bag. She had not opened it, but she had carried it for 5 years, and something about carrying a thing for that long means you know its weight, which means you know something about what is inside it even without opening it. Her father had been a man who said what needed to be said and did not say more. Whatever was in the envelope would be what needed to be said. Nothing more and nothing less. She was ready to hear it, but not yet. At 0247 hours, she picked up movement on the northeast ridgeline. Small, brief, the kind of motion that a man makes when he has been still for a very long time and shifts by a fraction to relieve pressure on a single point of contact with the ground, a movement so small it would have been invisible to anyone who was not already looking at that exact location with magnification and prior intelligence. She put her crosshairs on the center mass of where a human body would have to be to make that movement. 1,239 meters. Wind 7 miles per hour from the northwest, shifting slightly toward northwest-northwest as she watched the mirage through the scope. Not 7. Closer to 9. Maybe 9.5. She adjusted 2 more clicks left. At 0338 hours, the assault team radioed their departure from the staging position. 45 minutes to compound breach. She steadied her breathing. In for 4. Hold for 7. She squeezed. The M24 fired with the familiar authority of a precision weapon, doing what it was designed to do, and she cycled the bolt and found the target again in the scope immediately because that was what you did. You did not wait to see the result, you stayed in the process. The round had impacted 10 inches left of the target position. Not the wind. She had the wind right. The gust had shifted in the half-second of flight time, a variable that no calculation could fully account for at this range, the kind of variable that the best shooters in the world missed by the same margin on their worst days. 8 inches to correct. Approximately 4 seconds before Drachev, who was a professional with 50 kills and the reflexes of a man who survived this business by processing threat information faster than most people processed information of any kind, found her muzzle flash and completed his own calculation. She clicked 2 right. She found the space between heartbeats. She did not find it in time. The .338 Lapua Magnum round covered 1,239 meters in approximately 1.5 seconds. At 2,800 feet per second, it did not announce itself. The sound arrived after the damage. The damage arrived in her left shoulder. It was not pain, not initially. It was impact massive and total, a physical fact that rearranged everything in its vicinity. She was off the scope. She was rolling the body, doing what the body does when it is trained to survive, rolling away from the point of contact, creating lateral distance from a known threat vector, getting off the position where the threat had already located you. She came to a stop against the Wadi bank. Left arm. She looked at it with the clinical portion of her brain that had not gone offline. She tried to move the hand. The fingers moved. Slightly. Not well. The sensation in the arm was wrong, not the burning of a muscle wound, but something deeper and more fundamental, a wrongness in the signal pathway between intent and execution. She pressed her right hand against the entry wound. The exit wound was behind her left shoulder, larger, the characteristic damage of a round that had begun to destabilize on its way through. She pulled hemostatic gauze from the pack on her right side and pushed it into the entry wound and bit down on the sound that tried to come out of her and packed it and held it. 5 milligrams of morphine, not 10. 10 would manage the pain but not leave her functional for what still needed to happen. She waited for it to reach the shoulder. She tried again to lift the left arm. The fingers moved. The arm did not. She had worked in trauma medicine long enough to know what nerve damage felt like from the inside. She knew the anatomical region, C5 to C6, the nerve roots that govern the shoulder and upper arm, the ones that ran exactly where Drachev's round had passed. She knew the prognosis range. She knew that 60 to 70% recovery was the optimistic number and that optimistic numbers were not guarantees. She knew that this was not going to be different tomorrow morning. She held that for exactly the amount of time she could afford to hold it, which was approximately 4 seconds, and then she let it go into the category of things she would have to carry later because she did not have later available right now. She had the assault team. 41 minutes from compound breach when she had fired the first shot. Maybe 38 now. They would cover the remaining ground in that time, and then they would be in the open, and Drachev would be on them, and they would have no counter-sniper, and whatever she had promised herself about who she was going to be in this life would not matter to the families of the men who did not come home. She pulled the M24 toward her with her right hand. She could not use the bipod from a prone position with the left arm non-functional. She propped the rifle against the Wadi bank, found an angle, wedged the forend into a natural notch in the earthen surface. Not ideal, not anywhere close to ideal, but stable enough. Right hand on the grip, cheek to stock, eye to scope. The morphine was working. The shoulder was becoming noise rather than signal present, but not in control. She found the ridgeline. Drachev had repositioned slightly after the first exchange professional response to being counter-sniped, and she found him by the distinctive profile of the Orsis barrel extending from the new position. She adjusted, clicked 6 right to account for the positional change, recalculated drop for the slightly different range. 1,241 meters. Wind had stabilized at 9 miles per hour northwest. He was tracking the assault team now. She could see the barrel angle moving slow and deliberate, finding a target. 30 seconds before they were in his optimum engagement window. She breathed in. 4 counts. She held. 7 counts. She found the space between 2 heartbeats that were no longer running at 60 per minute, but were still slow enough Still controlled enough because the body she had built over 27 years of learning to be exactly this, knew what was required and was providing it despite everything that had happened in the last 4 minutes. She squeezed. The M24 spoke. 1 second and 8/10 of flight time across 1,241 meters of Afghan night. She watched through the scope. She watched the bullet find Alexei Drachev exactly where she had aimed, center of the visible target mass, and she watched him go down and stay down, and his rifle went one direction and he went another, and the ridgeline was quiet. She keyed her radio with her right hand. Her voice came out level, not because she was not in pain, not because she did not understand what had just happened to her arm or what it meant for the rest of her life, but because level was what the situation required and she had been built for what situations required. She said, Reeves, target down. Drachev is down, confirm kill. I am hit left shoulder, need extraction. Static. Then Reeves's voice tighter than she had ever heard it, the voice of a man who has just received information that changes a significant number of things simultaneously. He said, copy doc, medevac inbound, 15 minutes, stay with us. She said, not planning to go anywhere, Chief. She set the rifle down against the wadi bank with her right hand. She looked up at the sky. The stars were still there. Cassiopeia exactly where it was supposed to be. Orion setting in the west. The same sky her father had navigated by on night moves in places that had tried to kill him for 20 years before one of them finally succeeded. Somewhere to the north, she could hear the assault team breaching the compound. Small arms fire brief, then silence, then the controlled communications of a unit that had completed its objective. 2 contractors, Sullivan, Morrow, alive. Her right hand found the rifle beside her and rested on the forend, on the warm walnut wood, on the 2 words her father had carved there in small, patient letters. She held on. Part 3, both hands. The surgeon's name was Lieutenant Commander Patricia Webb, and she had been practicing trauma medicine in forward operating environments for 11 years, which meant she had learned to deliver difficult information the way you deliver it, when you respect the person receiving it enough not to soften it into something it is not. She came into the recovery bay at 0620 hours when the light outside the tent walls was just beginning to shift from black to the particular gray that precedes dawn in the mountains. Maya was awake. She had been awake for most of the 3 hours since the medevac had set down and the surgical team had gone to work on the shoulder, lying with her right arm across her midsection and her left arm immobilized against her side, and her eyes on the ceiling in the way that people's eyes go to ceilings when they are doing the kind of thinking that requires a neutral surface to look at. Webb pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down without preamble. She said the round passed through the posterior deltoid and compromised the suprascapular nerve at the C5 to C6 level. There was additional involvement of the axillary nerve branch. Structural damage bone and major vascular is manageable. You will have functional use of the arm within 6 to 8 weeks with appropriate rehabilitation. She paused. She said the nerve involvement is the part I need you to understand clearly. Maya said, tell me. Webb said in the best case with aggressive physical therapy beginning as soon as the surgical wound permits. And continuing for 12 to 18 months, you can expect to recover 60 to 70% of pre-injury strength and range of motion in the left shoulder and upper arm. Fine motor function in the hands should return largely intact. The deficit will be most pronounced in overhead strength and sustained load bearing. Maya was quiet for a moment. She said in the realistic case, not the best case. Webb said 50 to 60%, with variance depending on how the nerve tissue responds to the first 3 months of recovery. Maya looked at the ceiling again. Webb said, I want to be direct about what this means for continued service in a forward combat role. Maya said, you don't have to be. I understand what it means. Webb stayed in the chair. She did not stand up immediately the way doctors stand up when the clinical portion of a conversation is concluded. She sat with the information in the room for a moment, and Maya noticed it, the small thing that costs nothing and means a great deal. Then Webb stood and said, the physical therapist will see you at 9 a.m. The work starts today. The sooner it starts, the better the outcome. She left. Maya lay with her right hand flat on the thin mattress and her left arm in its immobilization brace, and she did the arithmetic that Webb had laid out for her. Not the medical arithmetic, the other arithmetic, the kind that does not have clean numbers. Her left hand had held a rifle since she was 10 years old, had learned on a Montana slope in weather that did not accommodate mistakes, had developed over 17 years of instruction and practice in the particular kind of muscle memory that does not live in the muscles but in the deeper architecture below them. That hand had packed wounds in Syrian dirt and held pressure on arteries and found veins in the dark in dehydrated patients and done across 14 years of medicine and before that of shooting the work that both disciplines required. That hand would not do those things the same way again. She was aware that this was the kind of loss that a person could organize a significant amount of grief around. She was also aware that two contractors named Sullivan and Morrow were alive this morning in a way they would not have been, and that the assault team that went through the compound gate at 0346 hours had come back with all personnel accounted for, and that the nerve damage in her left shoulder existed in direct proportion to those facts. She decided this was enough, not because it erased the loss, but because her father had taught her that the mathematics of what you have given and what remains are not always the mathematics that matter most. The mathematics that matter most are the ones that tell you what the situation cost and what it produced and whether one was worth the other. She ran that calculation until she was satisfied with the result. Then she heard the tent flap open. Harmon came in without an escort, which meant he had waited for a moment when the recovery bay was quiet and come alone. He was in uniform but not in gear, and he looked like a man who had not slept, which was accurate. He had spent the hours since the debrief doing what commanders do when operations conclude in ways that require explanation upward through chains of command, writing the reports that become the official record of what occurred, the language chosen with the full awareness that language about events like this takes on a life far longer than the events themselves. He crossed the bay and stopped at the bedside. He said Sullivan and Morrow were airlifted to Bagram at 0515, both in stable condition. Neither was significantly harmed during their captivity. She said, good. He said Drachev was confirmed by the assault team at 0412. Single wound center mass. The Weapons Intelligence Element's preliminary assessment describes the engagement conditions in language I have not previously heard them use. She said the conditions were not ideal. He said no, they were not. He was holding something. He held it out toward her, and she saw what it was before she fully registered the movement. The envelope. White, standard military issue, slightly creased in the pattern that 5 years of being carried and handled and not open leaves in paper. The name on the front in her father's handwriting. Maya. She did not reach for it immediately. Harmon said it came out of your pack during the initial field treatment. The medevac medic secured your personal gear, and this had come loose. He gave it to me because he was concerned about it being lost in the transfer. He paused. He said, I did not read it. I want you to know that. She looked at the envelope for a moment longer. Then she reached across with her right hand and took it. Harmon moved to the chair at the bedside and sat. Not close to the bed, not at a distance that suggested he was waiting for something. At the distance that suggested he understood this was not his moment, but that he did not want to be somewhere else for it. She looked at the envelope. 5 years since Jack Callahan had pressed it flat with his hands and written her name on it on a night in March of 2004, in whatever space he had found to write in before a mission he had known was compromised. She had been in Syria then 7 time zones away in work that did not exist on paper, doing things that her mother had never been told about, and that she had never entirely made peace with herself about either. She had been in Syria when the transmission came that he was gone. She had been in Syria for 6 more weeks before she could come home, and by the time she stood at the grave in the small Montana cemetery, the stone was already in the ground, and her mother had aged in the way that grief ages people permanently and without apology. She had stood there and made a promise with everything she had, built her service around it, had spent 5 years becoming the version of herself the promise required. She opened the envelope. The letter was 2 pages written in the same precise, economical hand she had recognized on 17 years of birthday cards and notes left on kitchen tables and the backs of targets at the Montana range. She read slowly and completely, letting each sentence land before moving to the next. He had written, if you are reading this, then the mission did not go as I hoped. I am sorry for that. I am sorry for the grief it has caused your mother, and I am sorry for the particular kind of grief it has caused you, which is different from hers, and which I understand better than you might think, because I watched my own father's generation carry it, and I know what it does to people built the way we are built. He had written, your mother will ask you to make a promise. She will ask because she loves you, and because love, when it is afraid, speaks in promises. Make the promise if you need to. Mean it when you make it. But understand what I am about to tell you. He had written, and I knew the intelligence was wrong before I went. I told my chain of command and was told the assessment had been verified above my level. I went anyway because my team was going, and I would not let them go without me. I do not regret that decision. I want you to understand that clearly. I made the choice I would make again. He had written, the man who signed the order will have to live with what happened. That is sufficient. Do not carry my anger, Maya. I do not have anger about this. I have grief for the time we will not have and the things I will not see you do. But anger at the system that put me in that position would require me to be surprised by the system, and I am not surprised by anything anymore. He had written, your mother will want you to put down the rifle. Put it down if you can. If you can build the life you want, without it, build that life, and it will be a good life. But if the day comes when putting down the rifle means someone standing in front of you does not go home, then pick it up. Pick it up without guilt and without apology and without the weight of a promise made by a person who loved you more than she understood what you are. He had written, you are both of us. You have your mother's care for people and her willingness to put herself where the need is greatest. And you have what I gave you, which is the precision and the patience and the understanding that some things can only be fixed at distance with the right tool from a position nobody expected you to occupy. He had written, use both of those things. Do not choose between them. The world does not need another healer who cannot protect what she heals, and it does not need another soldier who has forgotten what he is fighting to preserve. It needs people who carry life in both hands. You are one of those people. You were from the beginning. He had written, aim small, miss small, sweetheart. In medicine and in everything else, the precision is the same, the intention is the same. The result when you get it right is the same. He had written, I am proud of you for who you are right now today, whatever day you are reading this. Not for what you will do or become, for who you already are. That is already enough. He had written, love, Dad. She read it 3 times. By the 3rd reading, the tent was fully light outside, and the sounds of the bass coming into its morning rhythm were audible through the canvas, and her face was doing the thing it had not done since the graveside in Montana, which was the thing she had been telling it not to do for 5 years. She let it. Harmon had not moved. He was looking at the tent wall, and he was not looking at her, but he was aware of every second of what was happening beside him, in the way that you are aware of things that carry weight. When she finished the 3rd reading, she folded the letter along its original creases and put it back in the envelope and held it against her chest with her right hand. Then she said, he knew about you. Harmon turned. She said, he wrote that the man who signed the order would have to live with it. He said that was sufficient. He was not angry. He wanted me to know that. The fluorescent light above the bed was steady here, unlike the one in the operations room, and in the steadiness of it, Harmon's face did the thing it did not do in briefings and command settings. It did the thing it had been doing privately in the years since March of 2004, when the investigation concluded and the reprimand was filed and the system moved on the way systems move on completely and without looking back. He did not speak. She said he forgave you before he knew your name. That is the kind of man he was. Harmon stood from the chair. He was not entirely steady in the standing, and he turned away from the bed for a moment and looked at the tent wall and breathed. Then he turned back. He said, when I read the transmission transcript from March 11, 2004, there was a section near the end where the signal degraded significantly. The signal's intelligence team logged it as equipment failure. But I listened to the original recording directly, and I know what I heard in those last seconds before the signal dropped. He paused. He said he was not reporting status. He was talking to his daughter. I do not know what he said because the words were not recoverable. But I know the difference between a man transmitting information and a man talking to someone he loves. He was not alone at the end. I want you to know that. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, thank you, Colonel. He nodded. He picked up his cover from the foot of the bed. He put it on. He moved to the tent flap and stopped. He said, I am recommending you for a Navy Cross. The documentation is drafted. She said, sir, I would ask you not to. He turned. She said, the attention creates questions. The questions require answers I am not authorized to give. The 3 missing years in my file do not become less missing because I am standing in a ceremony. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, unit citation. The credit is distributed across the element. Your name appears in the supporting documentation classified for 20 years. She said, that works, sir. He said, the classified record will outlast both of us. She said, my father's classified record outlasted him. It will be enough. He left. The physical therapist came at 900, as Webb had said, and Maya worked for 40 minutes on the initial assessment protocols, moving the left arm through the available arc with the patient attention of someone who understands that the work between here and recovery does not respond to shortcuts. The therapist noted her tolerance and her focus in the chart in clinical language that did not capture any of what those things actually meant. Reeves came at 1400. He came in the way he did everything without announcement, with an economy of movement that was not unfriendly but had no interest in performance. He stood at the bedside for a moment and looked at her the way he had been looking at her since the first day she crossed the landing zone, seeing what was there rather than what he expected to find. He had something in his left hand, He set it on the pillow beside her head without speaking. A patch, cloth worn at the edges in the way that comes from being handled regularly over years rather than operational use. The insignia of SEAL Team 3 on a subdued background, the colors faded but the design clear. She looked at it. He said it came with his personal effects. Same shipment as the rifle. It was in the case in the interior pocket. I kept it for a reason I did not have, clear until recently. He looked at her for a moment longer at the shoulder immobilization and the IV line and the face that was showing something today. It had not shown on any prior day. The aftermath of grief, the face of someone who has passed through the specific country of it and come out the other side carrying something different than what they carried going in. He said, "How is the arm?" She said 50 to 70% recovery, depending. He said, "Depending on what?" She said, "The work." He nodded. He said, "Then you know what comes next." She said, "Yes." He turned to leave and stopped, the same way he had stopped in the berthing on the night he left the round on her rack. He said, "The shooting. The 400 meters 2 nights ago and the 1200 last night. I have been in this work for 26 years. I have been in a very large number of situations where precision under pressure was the deciding variable." He said, "I have never seen what I saw from you. Not once." He said it without inflation and without apology, as a statement of fact that he was presenting because it was accurate and because accuracy mattered. Then he left. 3 days later, Brody came. She was in the middle of the 1400 PT sessions shy, working through the prescribed range of motion sequence on the left arm. The shoulder complained about each repetition in the way nerve damage complains, not with the clean signal of structural injury, but with the diffuse language of damaged circuitry, tingling and heat, and the phantom sensation of a connection that had not fully reestablished. She kept working. He came in and sat in the chair at the bedside and watched her for a moment. He had the look of a man who has been composing something for several days and has decided the window for delivering it is closing. He said, "I owe you something." She kept moving the arm through its arc. She said, "You don't, Sergeant." He said, "I assessed you wrong on day one, so I looked at the visible information and ignored what I didn't have access to. That is not assessing correctly. That is called being wrong." She stopped the exercise and looked at him. He was not comfortable with this conversation. Brody was a man built for the language of action and operational work, and the kind of conversation he was attempting was not in his first or second language. He was doing it anyway, which told her something about the days since the Wadi. He said, "You ran 300 meters under fire to get to 2 casualties that were not your immediate problem. You put them back together in the dark with people shooting at you. You made a 400-meter shot with a weapon that wasn't yours. And then you went back out alone and made a shot that the weapon's intelligence element is describing in language I have never heard them use before." He said with one arm, after being hit. She said it was the only arm available. Something moved across Brody's face, then brief and not entirely identifiable in the category of things that are funny and devastating in roughly equal measure. He said, "Ghost would have liked you." He said it quietly in the way you say something you have been carrying for a few days and have finally decided is worth the cost of saying out loud. He said it, and then he stood and straightened his uniform and walked out without looking back. She sat with it. Not with the words themselves, though. The words were not nothing. With the thing behind them, which was the particular form of respect that men like Brody extend, which is not frequent and not given for the asking, and which comes out of the specific place where professional judgment meets personal understanding of what the work costs and who is paying it. Her mother called that Sunday the way she had called every Sunday since Maya was 19 years old, and first left Montana for places her mother could not follow. Maya told her about the shoulder. Not all of it, enough of it. Her mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The letter. Did you read it?" Maya said yes. Her mother said, "I knew he wrote one. He always wrote one before the ones he thought were difficult. He never told me what was in them." Maya said he told me not to carry his anger. He said you would ask me to make a promise and that I should make it if I needed to. Her mother was quiet again, the quiet of a woman who has been carrying something for 5 years and is finally putting it down somewhere she can look at it. She said, "Did you need to?" Maya thought about the Wadi, about the rifle in her right hand and the nerve damage in her left shoulder, and the 2 men who came home from that compound because of both. She said, "I thought I did. I don't think so anymore." Her mother said, "Good. Then come home when you can. The ranch needs new fencing on the north line, and I am too old to do it alone." Maya almost laughed. Almost. She said, "I'll be there in the spring." In January of 2010, she reported to Quantico. The program did not have a name yet. It was a pilot authorized through a chain of paperwork that connected Harmon's classified after-action report to a Marine Corps Training Development Office, to a working group that had been trying to build a curriculum around integrated combat specialization for 2 years, without finding a person who embodied the concept well enough to teach it. They had found that person. The classroom held 24 students, 12 combat medics, 12 designated marksmen. They ranged from 22 to 38 years old and had between them a combined service record covering 3 wars in 6 countries and more aggregate operational experience than most commands 3 times their size. They were skeptical, she could see that. The professional kind of skeptical, which is different from the personal kind, and which deserved to be addressed on its own terms. She stood at the front of the room and did not speak for a moment. She put 2 things on the table in front of her. The medical pack on her left. Battered marked the pack that had been on her back in the Wadi, and before that in Syria, and before that in the places that did not exist on paper. And on her right, the M24 with the custom stock and the match-grade barrel and the 2 words carved in the walnut forend. She let the students look at both of them. Then she said, "My name is Corman Maya Callahan. For the next 8 weeks, I am going to teach you to think about your work differently. Not better, differently." She said, "Medics, you are going to learn to shoot. Not because your job description requires it, because the situation will sometimes require it, and your job description will not be present to object." She said, "Shooters, you are going to learn emergency trauma medicine. Not because you expect to use it, because the man next to you may need you to use it in the 90 seconds before a corpsman can reach him. And 90 seconds is longer than you think and shorter than you need if you do not know what to do with it." She said, "Some of you are wondering what qualifies me to teach both of these things to people already trained in one of them." She looked at the room. She said, "That is a fair question. Here is the answer." She picked up the M24 with her right hand and held it so the room could see the forend clearly. The 2 words in her father's patient hand. She set it down. She said, "My father taught me to shoot when I was 10 years old. He taught me that precision and care come from the same place, that the discipline required to hold a rifle perfectly still and the discipline required to hold a wound closed for 3 minutes under fire are not different disciplines. They are the same discipline applied to different tools." She said his name was Jack Callahan. Some of you may know that name. If you do, then you understand something about where this curriculum comes from and what it costs to build it. If you do not know that name, you will by the end of this course, not because I will tell you stories, but because everything I am going to teach you carries his thinking in it, and the thinking will speak for itself. A hand went up. Young Marine front row. He said, "Ma'am, isn't it better to be genuinely expert at one thing than adequate at 2? She said, "Yes. And that is exactly what we are going to build. Not people who are adequate at 2 things, people who are expert at one and capable at the other, because the field does not respect the boundary between your specialty and what the situation requires. The medic who cannot protect his patient is a medic whose patients die on the way to the help they need. The shooter who cannot stop bleeding is a shooter who loses the man next to him in the 90 seconds before help arrives." She said, "We are going to fix both of those problems." She put her right hand on the medical pack. She put her left hand on the rifle stock. The left hand with its 63% and its scar tissue and its fingers that did not fully straighten settled onto the warm walnut and held it the way it had learned to hold things since the Wadi. Not with full grip strength, with support, with the understanding that her job was to create the conditions and then step back and let the work do what the work does. She said, "Both hands. Whatever you are carrying, whatever the situation requires, whatever the cost of using what you have been given. Both hands." The room was quiet. Not the skeptical quiet of 20 minutes ago, a different quality. The quiet that comes into a space when a group of people has simultaneously understood that the person at the front of the room is not describing a philosophy. She is describing herself. She looked at them for a moment longer. Then she said, "We start now. Medical pack in your left-hand, rifle in your right. Leave your assumptions in the hallway. You will not need them in here." They filed out. She stood alone in the empty classroom. The particular stillness of a space that is built to hold something important and has not yet begun holding it. She looked at the 2 things on the table. She thought about her father on a Montana slope in the fall of 1992, patient and unhurried, watching a 10-year-old girl learn the geometry of distance and wind. She thought about her mother in the ranch house kitchen on Sunday mornings when the training was done and the world was briefly simple. She thought about Reeves and the worn patch from SEAL Team 3 that was in her personal bag right now, carried forward from Kunar, the way she had carried the envelope as evidence of something that had not ended. She thought about the letter. She would read it again tonight the way she had been reading it in the weeks since the recovery bay. Not to memorize it, to return to it the way you return to a place that meant something, because each time you arrive, you are slightly different and you see something you did not see the time before. The last time she had read it, she had stayed longest with one line. Use both of those things. Do not choose between them. She had been choosing between them her whole adult life, or trying to be one thing fully by refusing to be the other, trying to honor the promise by becoming smaller than what she was. Her father had seen that coming from a long way off. He had written the answer before the question was fully formed in the patient handwriting of a man who had taught her that precision mattered in everything, including the things you left behind for the people you loved. The students were coming back across the quad now, rifles and medical packs, learning the weight of both before they learned what to do with either. She picked up the medical pack in her left hand. She picked up the rifle in her right. She stood with both of them for a moment, feeling the weight of each, the familiar and specific weight she had been carrying in one form or another since she was old enough to understand what her father was building in her and why. Then she set them back down on the table and waited for the door to open. Outside the window, the Quantico January was gray and cold. The trees along the perimeter bare and structural against a white sky, all the softness stripped away by the season until only the essential form remained. She had come to appreciate that quality in things, the essential form beneath the softness, the thing that was still standing when everything temporary had been removed. The door opened. 24 students filed back in and took their seats and looked at her. She looked back at them. She thought this is enough, not as consolation, not as the thing you tell yourself when you are trying to believe something, as a statement of what was simply plainly true. This was enough. Her left hand rested on the table beside the rifle. 63% and every degree of it earned in a wadi in Kunar province at 0340 hours on a September morning in the dark with one arm at 1,241 meters for reasons that did not require explanation because the reasons were standing in the room in front of her. She began,